Well, here we are back again talking about spiritual due diligence. I'm with Jeffrey Cranford, the president of Links Players, and we are on the third study, the nature of God, and we are moving to the sixth lesson in that study, which is called God Indwelling, and it talks about the Holy Spirit. And if you really want to freak somebody out, if you want to make somebody nervous today, you say, well, what do you make of the Holy Spirit? Because people are pretty comfortable talking about God the Father and pretty good talking about Jesus the Son, but once you mention the Holy Spirit, people get jittery. Why?
Well, I think there's so much, I mean, culturally, especially in the West, there's so much that have gone with, whether it be classic Pentecostalism, talking about speaking in tongues, and the dispensationalist, whether tongues still exist or whether the charismatic gifts still exist, and somehow the operation of the Holy Spirit in large part got kind of caught up in the charismatic movement. So I think in some people's minds it was too attached to the swinging from the chandeliers and snake handling or whatever they had, in their minds that were happening in these wild charismatic churches. But obviously the Holy Spirit is broadly diverse, and the essence of Christianity is to possess the Holy Spirit. I mean, it's Christ in us, which is the hope of glory, Paul says. So I think there's just some confusion as it relates to the operation of the Holy Spirit. Jesus was pretty plain about the Holy Spirit and why it was being sent. It was to convict the world of sin and righteousness and judgment. And so those three things that the Holy Spirit is constantly engaged in. He lives in us. The Spirit of God lives in us, which was purchased for us through the atonement, which was Jesus' death on the cross. And in fact was the promise, Paul says to the Galatians, that the Spirit was in fact the promise that was made to Abraham. So the blessing that would come in Genesis 12, there was a great promise that was made to Abraham, that in your seed all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. And so this was the promise of the blessing to the nations, was not just Jesus in terms of the cross, but ultimately the promise of the Spirit, which is what Paul begins to try to outline in his letter to the Galatians. So it was God's intent from the beginning to dwell with us. It was the case in the garden, as we had mentioned on an earlier topic, and his presence with us. And so now it purchases the atonement purchases the presence of God with us now, and eventually we'll have direct access to the heavenlies in eternity, and where we'll live with God forever. So it's kind of a down payment of sorts, which kind of Paul refers to, a down payment for what is coming, which is the presence of God in a fuller, more profound way in terms of experientially, I guess. But the Holy Spirit is certainly an integral part of anybody's supernatural walk with God, and indication of a Spirit. So that's why in Galatians 5 it says that the fruit of the Spirit is love and joy and peace and kindness and long-suffering and patience, etc., etc. That's all the fruit of the Spirit. Those fruits are coming from the inside out. They're bearing fruit outwardly in these various demonstrable ways, but it's the Spirit having been purchased by Christ and in us. So, and the confusion, I think, too, Jeff, about the laying on of hands, the second baptism of the Spirit, and in Acts, I believe it's 17, it talks a little bit about that, and they didn't know if they'd received the Holy Spirit, so they laid their hands on and received the Holy Spirit. And so one of the ways that I like to talk about this in our groups, especially because we have such an denominationally, we're just all over the place. We've got Catholics and evangelicals, charismatics, Pentecostals, seekers on most of our fellowship groups, is that if you struggle with that as an issue, I'm asking for the Holy Spirit every day. I'm asking that God would fill me with the Holy Spirit every day. And so in that sense, was it a separate experience? Well, the people still argue about that, but I'm saying ask God for the Holy Spirit on a continual basis. And I don't think he's going to withhold it from you because you didn't have the protocol in your denomination to facilitate it. Doesn't make sense to me.
Right. And that is true, that in some churches or congregations or denominations, you will hear the Holy Spirit referred to more often than in others, and yet there really is no orthodox, mainstream believing congregation that says, oh no, there's no Holy Spirit.
Yeah, sure. Part of the Godhead, part of the it's the beauty. And Jesus said, and this is the strange part, that it's actually better that I go away. Why would he say that? Because I'm going to send the Spirit. In John 14 and John 16, he promises the coming of the Holy Spirit. And why would that be better? Well, he can't, and his physical body couldn't be with everybody at the same time.
That's right.
It necessitated,
Right.
Again, the God in a transcendent sense, in a omnipresent sense, and that's via the Holy Spirit. And of course, this is not just New Testament theology. This is Old Testament theology as well. Isaiah 48 talks about His Spirit and the Son and the Father, and obviously the Spirit was there in the creation of the worlds in the very beginning. And so, yeah, the Holy Spirit is a precious, precious thing that I think sometimes we don't really appreciate. I think sometimes also when we're engaging in sinful acts, that's one of Paul's arguments. Don't you realize that God has purchased you and dwells in you? And if Jesus, through the Holy Spirit, is living in us, how would, for instance, we connect ourselves with a harlot or a prostitute? Because we